Start your day with It's the Business. Here's Phil Dobbie.
So it's likely this morning the ongoing trade agreement with the EU will have finally been ratified on both sides, and the President of the European Commission is making it clear that they are prepared to use it against us.
They are essential to ensure full compliance with the TCA and with the withdrawal agreement, which both were negotiated in such fine details and agreed by both sides.
So what happens now? What have been the effects so far, and how did we get here? Economist Vicky Pryce says, well, we've been objecting to rules and principles that Britain was at the front and centre of formulating in the first place.
We were very instrumental in setting up a lot of that regulation that exists right now in the EU, and a lot of the standards that exist right now in the EU. In fact, we were also the ones who pushed hard to have all the Eastern European or former Eastern European countries join the EU faster than perhaps anyone else would have been expecting. We are the ones who opened up our doors earlier in terms of migrants from those countries, and to then go and complain about these things seems a bit odd when you look at what our influence and all this had been.
So Brexit, what a shambles, basically. That's today. It's Wednesday, the 28th of April, 2021. Good morning.
And now, it's the business, making sense of it all with Phil Dobbie.
So remember when Boris signed the post-Brexit trade deal? Well, you don't have to think back too far, do you? Because it was at the end of December last year. Christmas Eve, in fact, right before the UK left the EU for good. And it was a big, fat, weighty tome, which Boris Johnson says he read. Well, at least he read the first few pages.
Here it is. Folks, this is it. And I know the question you will all be asking yourselves is have I read it? The answer is yes. And it's an excellent deal for this country.
Do you reckon? Well, we know the consequences, don't we? Fishing rights really have pleased nobody. Border checks into Northern Ireland from Great Britain, lost trade, and it's only just the beginning. Last night, the Europeans voted on the agreement. Well, we assume they did. You may know better than I do, because at 9 o'clock this morning, they're going to reveal what the vote was. Yesterday, Ursula von der Leyen warned the UK that the EU will be prepared to use the agreement against Britain if it needs to.
This agreement comes with real teeth, with a binding dispute settlement mechanism and the possibility for unilateral remedial measures where necessary. And let me be very clear. We do not want to have to use these tools, but we will not hesitate to use them if necessary. They are essential to ensure full compliance with the TCA and with the withdrawal agreement, which both were negotiated in such fine details and agreed by both sides.
Well, the vote on the trade and cooperation agreement has been made. The results, as I say, are expected at 9 o'clock this morning. It is expected to be a formality, because it's already in operation, isn't it? And we're already feeling the consequences. And it's all a big mistake, something Michel Barnier said yesterday. Here he is talking through an interpreter.
It's a warning, Brexit, and it's a failure of the European Union. And we have to learn lessons from it.
Well, will the EU change? It would be nice if it changed and we came back in, wouldn't it? But look, it's hardly news here today. In fact, Brexit has been lost a bit in the midst of COVID-19 and Boris Johnson's refurbishment of number 10, it's fair to say. So it's only being used by those who want to score points. The fact that Britain is doing so much better than the rest of Europe at rolling out the vaccine. And that could have been the case if we'd stayed in the EU. Maybe we'll visit that point in a moment. But the important thing to remember is we're going to be rid of COVID-19 at some point. And when that happens, Britain is still not going to be part of the EU. So is that a good thing? Or can we already have seen the impacts of our decision on our trade with Europe? Well, let's talk about it with Vicky Pryce, former joint head of the UK's Government Economic Service. She's an economist. She is a firm Brexiteer. Let's be upfront and honest here, Vicky. If people are expecting, we will try and be balanced. But we're both on the same side of the fence on this. We think Brexit was a bad idea. Let's start with some numbers. And I will try and be fair on this because there were a lot of people in January saying, oh, look, case closed. Exports to the UK from the UK into the EU fell 41% in January. There we are. Look how bad it all was. But of course, a large chunk of that was pent up demand, wasn't it? And then we saw those exports bounce back by 47% in February. But that still means if you go down 41% and then back up 47%, you're still 13% down. Whereas the rest of the world Well, it's about 10% down because of the effect of COVID-19. I'm sure the government would say these are teething problems which are impacting them. Actually, the differential isn't that great, is it? I mean, we're, 10 to 13%. It could be that we do pick up that trade with Europe. What do you reckon?
We might indeed, but the question is, what have we lost from a permanent basis where we were before and where we might be ending up? So there will be ups and downs. There is no doubt that as the economies all recover, we're going to see some trade sort of picking up. But the question is, what's happened to the underlying trend? And there'll be months when things look good. There'll be months when things don't look too good. But if you look at it on an average basis, what we had already seen before the end of the transition period is that trade with the EU was slowing down generally, even if you exclude the pandemic impact. And there has been work done by the Centre for European Reform, which looks at what was happening in similar countries and therefore comparing that with what the UK should have been doing, if indeed it was, as was before, part of the EU. And they've calculated that there had already been, basically since the referendum vote, a loss of trade with the EU, with the result that we were trading at something like 10% below where we would have been otherwise. But that's quite significant. So irrespective of what happens, because of different rates at which we're all going to be growing and coming out of the pandemic over the next year, that impact is probably and most likely going to stay there with us. But we shouldn't really just be fixated on trade. I think it's on goods in particular. It's much, much wider. I mean, the real issue is what's happening to costs to businesses, what's happening to non-tariff barriers.
Yeah.
So we may be trading with no tariffs as such, but actually the legislation that we've agreed to in terms of how we sell to the EU includes huge amounts of checks, health checks. Some of our products can no longer be sold like shellfish to the EU from, say, Scotland. And that has been a serious problem, too, for some sectors of the economy. Of course, fishing isn't that great as a percentage of GDP, but it has been very emotionally
It's still people's livelihoods, isn't it? And absolutely. Well, and it was one of the reasons that we were leaving. It was taking back control of our borders and taking back control of our waters. And I'm looking at Plymouth City Council. And I think this story has been echoed around the country for weeks now. Plymouth City Council saying that their fishing industry has been decimated. They say that the trade agreement with the EU is a betrayal to the fishing industry. Fishermen can't catch as much as they could before. And the processing industry, this is what you're talking about, has been hit with red tape and extra costs. Nobody has won from this in the fishing industry.
I'm afraid not. And, perhaps there will be more fish available for domestic use and prices may come down a little bit for a while. But, of course, it's not very good for the long term unless some way of getting around this is found. And the interesting thing is that the government has appreciated that this is an issue. Lots and lots of small firms are complaining about this, or the surveys done by the British Chambers of Commerce are showing that very clearly, that loads of smaller firms are thinking of just not exporting anymore in the future. Many have stopped doing so in the short term anyway, waiting to see whether there are going to be any changes. So what the government here has done, it has allocated some money for firms that are facing these difficulties on the Brexit front. So at least it's acknowledged that this is a problem. And it's also, of course, decided to unilaterally extend the period over which there weren't going to be any serious checks in the UK itself, when things coming in from the EU would have been stopped and looked at and lots of paperwork would be required. Because, of course, all that adds to cost of anyone who is importing as well. We've got to bear in mind that it's a two-way trade, and many goods, let's say in manufacturing, go in and out of the UK before they get into the finished product a number of times. In the car industry, something like 6 times on average. So if you stop that or make it much more difficult, it takes longer or it's more costly because of all the checks, then obviously there is less incentive to produce anything here, and foreign direct investment will go somewhere else. Yeah,
and all those so stopping the checks on imports. Obviously, we can't do it on our exports in the same way. We've got control over our imports, and then giving money to help out certain sectors. I mean, it's just kicking the can down the road. And that is the problem, isn't it? Ever since 2016, that can has been kicked so many times. And I was thinking, well, okay, at least when we get to December, the can kicking has got to stop. But it hasn't, has it? Because we had a deal which really was just a superficial deal. The actual trade agreement that we want to have with Europe, we still haven't reached. that can is still being kicked. And I just wonder whether it's all just from the beginning, the whole thing was too difficult. Obviously, the EU has it's in their self-interest to make it as complicated as possible, because obviously all the way along the line, they've not wanted others to see that it's easy and follow Britain down a similar path.
Well, what the EU is concerned about is making sure that whatever comes into their region follows strict rules, particularly on the health front. So what they have suggested just recently is that, and of course they will ease those restrictions for anything going in if the UK accepts the regulatory framework on agricultural products, for example, and food generally, that exists in the EU. And of course, the whole point of leaving the EU, according to the government that pushed for it, and the sort of the part of the political group that was very keen that we should do it, was to take back control and do our own stuff, if you like, on the regulatory front. Well, if we were to accept EU regulations, then obviously it becomes a lot easier for anyone to be exporting in the way that they did before. But it's going to be a tough one to expect this current government to accept, given the negotiating stance that we had so far, which has not been particularly friendly to the EU, and frankly, as a result, the EU hasn't been particularly friendly to the UK. Well,
that has been a big part of the problem, hasn't it? I'm just wondering whether, as a result of that, we've seen that the regulations have been overplayed by the EU, because of course, before this happened, I mean, we didn't have open borders, of course, but before with other parts of the world. But before this happened, we didn't have those regulations. Nothing has changed. It's still the same lamb that is being grown in Wales, for example, as it was before. And yet, with now much more stringent checks. And I guess, the EU is going to say, well, we do that for all third countries. You are just another third country. I mean, if we played it right, I wonder whether we could actually say, well, OK, we are a third country, but we're a little bit different in that we were part of the EU. We are part of Europe. We do adhere to some of the same standards. Let's ease off on some of the regulation. I just wonder whether it is politics that's got in the way and made it so tricky for everybody.
I'm sure politics has played a very big part. And we could easily have said, yes, we accept the regulations. After all, as you rightly say, they've been more or less the same. Now, of course, we have all these rules of origin. I mean, it's not just the regulations, of course. We've left the customs union too. So whatever comes in needs to have a proper tariff imposed on it as far as the EU is concerned when it gets back to them. And we have to really check each time, what has gone into whatever it is that we are then trying to sell to the EU. And that's complicated issues. But I think it's much, much wider than this. Of course, goods matter. Goods exports are important and imports are important. We have a deficit there. Where we have a surplus is in services. And that has been left dangling there without any proper conclusion. So the agreement, the comprehensive, as it's called, sort of trade agreement that we've got, is not really comprehensive at all, because it doesn't really touch on a large part of the economy. In fact, the largest part of the economy, and that's where the problems, I think, are. So when we're talking about the importance of being able to trade freely, we have to look at all those aspects that make that trade, even from goods, easier, so that your logistics firms work properly, your road hauliers are able to take things from A to B and then maybe to C and so on, and do it in a way which is profitable at the end of the day, but also reduces your own costs as you're doing it. Profitable for those firms that do the transporting, but also keeps costs down for businesses and ultimately the consumer. Well, rules have changed because we're no longer in the single market. And what this means, unfortunately, is, for example, before a road haulier could, collect something from the UK, a British one, and then go into the EU and do sort of 3 trips within the EU. So taking a load from another part, taking it somewhere else, and travel therefore more or less full, throughout the time that they're in the continent, and then come back to the UK. Well, now you can only do this once in the EU. Similarly with airlines. So that's a big issue because, you're selling freight, sending it across and then perhaps you have to transfer it somewhere else and then it carries on. Well, freight is under a slightly different regulatory regime, but nevertheless, what you've got is a serious problem in terms of being able to enjoy the low-cost benefits one had before, which of course means that quite a lot of businesses are giving up because the costs have increased very significantly.
Right. So, I mean, that's an important point, isn't it? So what you're saying is if I drove a truck down to Marseille, for example, and I used to pick something up at Marseille and drop it off in Paris and then pick something else up in Paris and take it back to London, I can't do that anymore.
You can do this once. You can do it once. You can pick up something from Marseille, take it to Paris, but then you've got to come back. Right. Whereas before you could do more trips.
So I can't pick anything up. I can't pick up anything in Paris to bring back to the UK, though. Is that what you're saying?
You can still do that, but of course it reduces your ability to go and pick it up from somewhere else.
Yeah.
Because that's how things work. That's where supply chains have been established in a certain way that allow you to get to those sort of cheapest.
We've also got this crazy situation, haven't we? Because the paperwork is based on per product or per product line. So if I've got which is fine if I've got a truck which is filled with one thing, but if I'm a supermarket that's replenishing my stocks and I've got 50 or several hundred different product lines sitting in the back of my truck, then that creates a nightmare, which is why we're having supermarkets now saying, well, for Northern Ireland, we're just going to have to stick our warehouses in the Republic of Ireland to service domestic business for the UK because it's just too complicated to cross that border into Northern Ireland from the British mainland.
And of course, loads of people are doing precisely that, but of course it tends to be the bigger firms.
Yeah.
So what's happening really is that even if trade picks up, there will be a lot more concentration. So quite a lot of small firms, which do provide quite a lot of employment, will have suffered. And we've already seen coming out of the pandemic how many firms are in financial difficulty right now. So there's been a recent estimate that at the latest count is something like 900,000 firms, small and medium-sized firms, which are in difficulty, and a number of them may just go under, which is higher than what you'd expect in a normal year. But then you've got the Brexit additionally, so taking any extra cost to be able to meet the new requirements is quite impossible for many, and that's the real issue. And then when you look more generally at what's happening in the service sector overall, we're not really talking just about the sort of areas that I mentioned, whether it's hauliers or airlines and so on, but the financial, professional and business services, which are absolutely key to the UK's service sector, are under threat as well. That's where we have our strength. The interesting thing is if you look at the London market, it provides 60% of the world's aviation insurance, for example, 33% of shipping insurance. There are 200 foreign banks, which
the horse is already bolted on this, though, isn't it? Because a lot of these companies have just set up European operations so that they can continue. And I'm not quite sure how big a hit it is to the UK parent company if they've now got an office in Europe. Certainly, I know it's an issue, and there's crazy stuff I hear about, like for example, how Europe's trying to take control of all euro clearing. A lot of which happens in the city, which is crazy because it's just a clearing of a currency. It doesn't have to happen on the territory of the currency. That would mean all Russian rubles would have to be traded in Russia. It doesn't work like that, does it? But I'm just wondering what the ultimate impact is on the city, because I hear a lot of businesses saying, well, to us it's actually not been that great, not that bad. We've just opened an office in Paris or Frankfurt.
It's where, of course, some of the profits go and where you're exporting from, if you like. So if we're thinking about trade again, which I think is how we started the conversation, if you look at data for 2019, the pandemic was a weird year. We have to accept that. But the UK in 2019 exported a total of £318 billion worth of services, and financial services were the largest of those, if you look at a particular component, and they were worth 59.2 billion. So, it's quite substantial. And of course, the financial services sector itself contributes something like 70 billion of taxes to the exchequer. So this is quite significant. So the question is, where are those profits going to be? Where are all these people going to be? Because a large percentage of what that tax figure was payment of tax by people who work in the sector. So if they start working somewhere else, or the ones who are here get paid less because of whatever reason, that is sort of less attractive and less profitable being here, then you see that impact through the economy. And the interesting thing is that professional and financial services, and professionals include, all those accountants, lawyers, and so on that provide the services for the city. They're spread all around the UK. So although I talked about the city, the financial sector is a major employer in loads of regions across the UK. So there is a lot of concern about what will happen to that in the future. So yes, we say that, well, it's the city and who cares about financial services given what happened in the past. But we mustn't forget, I'm talking about professional services. It's architects. It's also, if you look at the services more generally, the musicians who are finding it difficult now, the creative industry more generally. So we're talking about sectors that employ loads of people and whose services we've been exporting for quite some time. It's people coming in for venues with their business people, and we don't have the ability at present to ensure that they can stay here without any sort of tax penalty because we've moved out of the single market and the customs union and basically the EU, and we're a third country. So you need to have any good reasons for coming here and staying and doing any business. Similarly, with us going the other way, that's a serious problem. It's students already touched on the Erasmus program, which has gone for students to go elsewhere. So if you add all those up, and they make up a very substantial part of the economy and a very substantial part of our knowledge base, then that is a concern about the future. So it's not just goods, but it really is everything around those goods and the services that make it possible.
Are we going to be able to fix this? If we had a less adversarial approach and more of one of cooperation, I don't know whether that can be achieved, because we've obviously got the British press driving the agenda. The one great thing about Europe is they don't have any newspapers owned by Rupert Murdoch. I think he might own a bit of Sky in Italy, but I'm not sure that relationship between Sky and the Italian government's going down that well either. But I mean, that I think that's probably contributed a bit to all of this. But if we got over all of that and we had a spirit of cooperation, could we map out a way that Britain can stay out of the EU, but we actually have a workable relationship which isn't going to damage Britain quite so much and could actually be something that helps the Europe and Britain grow together? I mean, is that too much to ask?
No, it's not too much to ask. We could have had the type of deal that allowed for services to be more freely traded. Again, we'll have to accept some of the EU sort of legal if you like, framework that exists.
But why didn't that happen? Is that because
it's politics?
I'm
afraid that is politics,
right.
and economics was forgotten throughout the debates, and it's interesting because I know you like quoting figures. And we've seen what happened.
Which I just
trade,
I've got this strange like of facts, Vicky. That's what I like to use.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. But unfortunately, the facts were just not listened to, or at least they were disputed quite a lot. And yet, if you just look at what was going on before, I think it's just useful to remember that. So, I mentioned the creative industry. We export 22 billion in services from the creative industries. So 2/3 of those are digital services, which is really quite interesting. Of course, IT has gone up quite significantly as part of the economy, if you like, everywhere because of the pandemic. But just look at travel services. I mean, people coming here, that's 12% of our UK services exports. Transport services, 10%. So those are not insignificant.
No.
As part of our overall economy, and they employ loads of people. And of course, it has also helped hugely put the UK in a place in the world economy and the world league tables that we wouldn't otherwise have been able to do. And the EU has helped hugely in this because it has provided us with a much bigger market. So you can grow at scale. And of course, we know why the EU was helpful generally, because of course, with this bigger market, you could have economies of scale, you could produce more because you had a bigger market, and as you know in economics, average costs go down as you start increase your production with the same sort of facilities, if you like, for a bit. Yes, of course, you may need to change things a little bit later. You have a lot of competition from elsewhere, and therefore you become more productive, inevitably. So in order to become more productive, you invest and you innovate. The moment you take a lot of that away, then your productivity suffers, your growth suffers.
Yeah.
And that's the main concern that everyone has who is doing forecasts on what the hit might be, which is this loss of long-term productivity which is going to be significant.
Plus the fact, if we're trading with the rest of the world more than we are with Europe, then you're expanding supply chains, and we've seen the dangers of that with COVID, and also getting a ship trapped in the Suez didn't help in that case either. But I'm wondering whether the future relationship then is that it stays how it is, but with a better deal, a better agreement, something which is more thoughtful and less driven by politics. Or is that just too complicated? So let's take, for example, the idea that we have a level playing field. I think it's impossible to achieve, isn't it? Particularly, with the pandemic, we've got governments pumping money into their economies. I mean, how do you deal with that? How do you say, well, you can't rescue your economy because they're not rescuing their economy quite so much. So look at, for example, yesterday on the podcast, we were talking about how Alitalia, completely propped up by the Italian government, has been for years, whereas in the UK we let airlines like Flybe, for example, collapse with no government support. So there's different attitude. How do you get a level plan? That's just one example. How much you're pushing into supporting businesses, and whether you're putting money into growth industries to try and get the edge over your competitors. It's impossible to get an agreement like that, isn't it, where you get a level playing field? I know everybody tries, and this is exactly why free trade agreements run into hundreds or thousands of pages.
The truth is that even when we were members of the EU, there were huge differences across. We did argue here in the UK that leaving the EU would allow us to get out of state aid rules, which are the sort of thing that's been used for Alitalia, for example, and others. But the reality is we never used them to the full extent that we could. And the percentage of cash that was being spent on state aid in the UK had tended to be consistently lower than that was the case in Germany and in France. So it's not as if under the EU you didn't have different ways of dealing with things within an overarching regulatory framework. The differences were enormous. And they continue to be enormous through, for example, the Eurozone crisis. So we dealt with it differently. The EU dealt with it differently too. There wasn't a sort of common approach. There were many areas where, in fact, both areas where one could do one's own thing within certain limits, but those limits were pretty wide in most cases. Yeah. What we did, though, have, which was common, was the common market, not discriminating against each other in the single market. So you would have a sort of level playing field in inverted commas. But of course, governments differed hugely in the way in which they interpreted the rules. We are free now to negotiate our own trade deals. And hey, Vicky, we're going to have one in a couple of months. We're going to have one with Australia, which I think is going to increase our exports by 0.3%, possibly. So, and Tim Tams might be cheaper, which are very nice chocolate biscuits. So that's very exciting, isn't it? And we might have one with the United States, perhaps, although perhaps less likely with Joe Biden. This is another thing we've been told. This, global Britain, more trade deals. But I mean, we were covered by a considerable number of free trade deals when we were part of the EU, of course. Let's ignore that part of the argument. Indeed, I think that's a serious issue. What we have done so far is just rolled over the trade deals that we had already participated in before as part of the EU, and that's good news at least. But indeed, they don't really account for an awful lot of our trade. The trade that we have done in the past that we'll continue to do, and hopefully some of the trade figures coming in future months will be a bit better with the EU, is indeed with the EU. 45% of our goods and services go to the EU, have done traditionally. Yes, they've come down a little bit as a percentage of the overall trade because obviously we've had, the Pacific region, going up in the world and, exports to China and so on, although we're still quite low in terms of direct exports to China. We do a lot of it through selling to, say, Germany as part of the manufacturing supply chain. So we still need the EU there to be able to even export to China. So those new trade deals that we have signed are not really adding anything very much at all to our overall trade prospects, if you like. And particularly worrying is that none of those deals really make a difference on the services side. We have seen that most FTAs, free trade agreements, don't include services. And all forecasts that I have seen suggest that any loss in trade and services that we suffer because of leaving the EU will not be made up by anything that we do in terms of new trade deals. So certainly not in the foreseeable future.
So unless the upshot is that we become a much more protectionist economy that somehow manages to, and which we know is not a sensible way forward, but somehow manages to produce domestically for its economy, and it can make up some of the losses in that way. But that seems a bit unlikely. Look, how do we get out of this? What's the do we go with cap in hand and say, can we come back, please, or do we get a better deal? What's the way forward, Vicky? How do we, given that we've shot ourselves in the foot, how do we recover?
I would imagine first we have to try and get a better deal across all sectors, really, and accept some more sort of common regulation across, because there is no point in diverging in let's say, in food and agriculture exports. Or if it means that, given that most of that export goes to the EU, we then can't do this easily, or it's increased cost to everybody. So that's number one. Number two is to see whether maybe one could join the sort of smaller grouping of countries like the EEA countries, which includes, for example, Norway, where you have a sort of hybrid rule where you join some areas but not in others. So Norway is in the single market and not in the customs union.
So that was talked about, wasn't it? And I think Norway was saying, well, we don't want anything to do with you. I think it was...
Well, it may, but you could have reframed the whole thing into some different type of relationship. I think Norway was also telling us, don't think that it's particularly easy being where we are. But nevertheless, we have some say in what those rules are that are being formed, do in the future. But the worry, again, politically had been that, we can't control what happens, and we just have to take regulation as it comes. But remembering that, of course, that we were very instrumental in setting up a lot of that regulation that exists right now in the EU, and a lot of the standards that exist right now in the EU. In fact, we were also the ones who, pushed hard to have all the Eastern European or former Eastern European countries join the EU faster than perhaps anyone else would have been expecting. We are the ones who opened up our doors earlier in terms of migrants from those countries, and to then go and complain about these things seems a bit odd when you look at what our influence and all this had been. Yeah,
well, I don't know how we get out of it. Rupert Murdoch's getting on in years. Maybe the situation, or maybe the politics will get a bit better, Vicky, and we'll see. But something clearly needs to change. Do you think, because it's not front and centre of public discourse right now, because we do have a pandemic on at the moment, which seems to occupy every single second of the day. But I wonder whether, as COVID-19 clears up, it'll become apparent just what we have done.
It's interesting when you look at what the papers are saying, and you're quite right, of course, that, depending on their political affiliation, if you want to call it that, leanings, they either, downplay or overplay the problems of Brexit. But I've been quite surprised that one of the papers that has really been highlighting quite a lot of very well-researched articles, the problem of small firms in particular dealing with the EU, has been the Daily Mail.
Yeah.
So
change of editor.
I'm surprised. Yes,
that's what I mean. There's a change of editorial direction. I mean, that's,
yes. So who knows?
Yes, who knows? Exactly. All right. Okay. Well, great to talk, Vicky. We'll get you on again soon if that's okay with you. It's been an illuminating half hour. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
The Daily Mail this morning, incidentally, is leading the attack on Boris Johnson again today. The PM facing rap for free Mustique Villa. Where he did he go down there for Christmas? I think the fury over the decor scandal, and Boris saying he can't afford to pay for all of this. That is also the story dominating the front pages for the second day in a row on most of the newspapers. PM urged to come clean about cash for number 10 revamp, says The Guardian. The Independent says there are 3 questions to answer. Who lent Johnson £58,000 to redecorate his flat? Were any rules broken in his failure to declare this loan? And here's the crucial one, I think. Was anything given to the donor in return for the money? Because we don't know who the donor is. Are we going to suddenly find he gets a knighthood in the next incoming months, and we're not going to know about it? The Times says 40 million people now live in areas almost free from COVID. Those numbers have come right down, haven't they? I mean, we've still got lots of people testing positive, but that is going down too. In the last 7 days, we've seen a 21% fall in hospital admissions. a similar fall in the number of deaths. Just 17 deaths reported yesterday, which is nothing when you consider on average 460 people a day die from heart disease. So this is a massive success story for the UK, isn't it? When you consider in mid-January, we were seeing 1,200 people a day dying from COVID. So vaccines work, it seems, and lockdowns. Unfortunately. But let's hope it's more the former than the latter right now. That's it for today. We look at retail tomorrow. How are retailers adapting to our shifting shopping patterns? That's tomorrow morning. I'll see you then. Thanks for listening.
It's the Business with Phil Dobbie. Listen online at itsthedotbusiness or wherever good